For a lot of people, when you hear the phrase God's limits, it brings up feelings of fear, maybe judgment, definitely punishment. But what if that whole way of thinking is a misunderstanding? What if those limits aren't chains at all, but are actually more like the walls of a garden designed to help us grow and flourish? Let's explore that. Okay, so let's break this down. On one side, you've got the classic view. God's limits are a list of rules with some pretty harsh penalties if you step out of line. But on the other side, there's this totally different perspective, that there are actually protective boundaries, sacred lines drawn in the sand to keep us safe and guide us. So which one is it, really? All right, so let's start with what's become a really common misunderstanding and how this huge, expansive spiritual idea got kind of boiled down into something much, much scarier. When most of us hear hududillah, or God's limits, our minds immediately jump to legal punishments, right? For things like theft or adultery or slander. And look, while those are part of a larger legal system, focusing only on them is like going to see a masterpiece and spending the whole time just staring at the frame. You're missing the entire point, the whole picture. So you really have to ask yourself, is this narrow focus on punishment the whole story? Is that the main message we were supposed to get? Or is it possible we've been overlooking a much deeper, way more personal meaning this whole time? To really get to the bottom of this, we got to go back to the source. Let's take a look at what the word limit, or hudud, actually means in its original context. It's all about boundaries for a better life. So the Arabic word hudud literally just means boundaries, borders, the lines that separate one thing from another. A perfect way to think about it is like a property line around your house, or even a national border. These lines aren't there to punish you. They're there to create order, safety, and just clarity. They define a space where you can be free and secure. And check this out. Here's a perfect example of this idea in the real world. After laying out all these detailed rules about money, specifically about inheritance, the Quran calls these rules the limits of God. Now notice, this has absolutely nothing to do with criminal law. These are boundaries for fairness, set up to prevent fights and protect people, creating harmony. Now this is where it gets really, really profound. The text actually connects respecting these boundaries with experiencing Jannah, or paradise, not just in the next life, but right here, right now, on earth. It's a life of ease and peace. And on the flip side, when you transgress those limits, you invite nar, or fire, into your life here on earth. That's the hardship, the chaos, the inner turmoil we create for ourselves when we cross those protective lines. Okay, now for the really fascinating part. What happens when we take this idea of protective boundaries and apply it to the one thing that truly makes us human? Let's talk about freedom, the ultimate boundary. I mean, think about it. The sun, the moon, the animals, they all kind of follow a divine program. They don't really deviate. But us? We are the only creation given this incredible and incredibly heavy gift of choice. So this freedom we have, it's not just another boundary, it's the most significant, the most sacred, the most important limit of them all. And this sacred responsibility even has a name, al-amana, or the trust. The Quran paints this powerful, almost cinematic picture of it, a burden so immense, the burden of free will, that the heavens, the earth, and the mountains literally trembled and refused to carry it. But humanity, in our boldness, we stepped up and said, we'll take it. And the Quran is just crystal clear about this. When we violate these sacred boundaries, we're not just breaking some abstract rule. It says we are directly harming ourselves. It's not about making some distant deity angry. It's a straight-up act of self-sabotage. And that leads to a really powerful personal question you have to ask yourself. All the hardship, the anxiety, the conflict we deal with in our lives, could it just be the fallout? Could it be the nar on earth that is the direct result of us crossing our own limits or the limits of other people? Okay, so let's bring this all down to earth. If freedom is the ultimate sacred boundary, what does it actually mean to cross that line? How does this play out, not in some ancient court, but in our everyday lives with the people around us? So what does violating this freedom look like? Well, some examples are pretty obvious, right? Like trying to force your faith on someone else, or trying to control every aspect of their life. But then there are the sneakier, more subtle violations, like the poison of slander and gossip. You're literally trying to shape someone's reality without their permission. And then, maybe the most common one of all is simply judging other people. Just stop and think about that for a second. What does it really mean to look at another person and slap a label on them? You're a sinner. You're a hypocrite. You're misguided. In that very moment, you are stepping over one of the most sacred lines there is. You're trying to take away the very freedom, that amana that God gave them. You're basically trying to play God. So how do we stop ourselves from doing this? And how do we protect our own freedom? Well, the path laid out is not about blind faith or just following the crowd. It's the total opposite. It's about active, critical thinking. First, you read. You go to the source yourself. Then you ponder. You reflect on what it really means. Third, you verify. You don't just take anyone's word for it. And finally, you think. You use that amazing brain you were given. This is the toolkit for honoring your own trust. So, when you put it all together, this new way of seeing God's limits leaves us with a pretty profound choice. Every single day, in every conversation, we're using our freedom, our amana. So the question is, are we using it to respect the sacred boundaries in ourselves and in other people? And in doing so, creating a kind of paradise of peace and respect? Or are we crossing those lines, building prisons of judgment and control and conflict for ourselves and for everyone around us? The choice, and all its consequences, is entirely our own.